Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. When you review a government's performance, it's important to seek out the facts from independent sources. And when it comes to infrastructure investment under the current government, there's no better source than the Australian Bureau of Statistics. ABS figures show that between the September quarter of 2013, Labor's last quarter in office, and the June quarter of 2015, the latest figures, public infrastructure investment fell by 20%, a cut of $1 in 5. The 2015 budget papers show that this government cut infrastructure investment by $2 billion over this year and next year compared to its own 2014 budget. Victoria down $812 million, Queensland down $613, South Australia $318, Tasmania $31, ACT $12 and New South Wales $43. These huge cuts to infrastructure investment at a time when the minerals sector is moving from the construction to the production phase, and when infrastructure investment is so important, means that this government's rhetoric simply hasn't matched its reality. Remember the former Prime Minister saying he wanted to be the infrastructure Prime Minister? Well, he's had a bit to say over the last couple of days, Mr Speaker, and in his highlights of his achievements, he ignores infrastructure. He ignores infrastructure. And no wonder, because we were told that under a coalition government there will be cranes on the skylines within 1 year of their election and the sound of bulldozers at work. When you look at the facts 2 years later, there are no cranes on new projects, there are no bulldozers on new projects, just clouds of bulldust from a government that has not had the ability to put its words into action. We've seen the cancellation of all funding for public transport projects that were not under construction. $3 billion from the Melbourne Metro, $715 million from the Cross River Rail project, $500 million from light and heavy rail in Perth, $31.5 million from the Tonsley Park project in South Australia, the cut to the Gawler line electrification that was already underway, the money that was there to investigate Hobart Light Rail, all of it cut, all of it cut. And where was the money put into? The money was put into 3 projects, the East-West Link, that we know in Victoria had a cost-benefit analysis of 0.45, 45 cents return for every dollar invested. And yet they made an advance payment, contrary to their own policy, that's now subject to an Audit Office report, of $1.5 billion that's been sitting in the Victorian government's bank account for now 2 financial years, not creating any jobs, not building anything. A disgraceful performance. And of course, Perth Freight Link, a thought bubble that simply does not add up, where the WA government itself is saying that they can't proceed with stage 2, a project that goes through wetlands, a project that has no proper business case at all. And of course, WestConnex in Sydney, where again $2 billion has been paid as a loan or made available to the New South Wales government, $750 million prepaid to the New South Wales government, and yet we find out last week that the cost has blown out even more. The $10 billion project that became a $12 billion project, that's become a $14 billion project, that's now an almost $17 billion project. The project that began as a road to the port that goes nowhere near the port, that goes to St Peters, that has an interchange in the most heavily congested area of Sydney. A project that requires, again, a proper business case. This is a government that said for all projects above $100 million they would do just that, but they haven't done it. We've seen no progress delivering the much-needed inland rail freight line, a project of which we contributed more than $600 million, or just under $600 million for the existing part of the project and $300 million in the budget. They have not added one new dollar to that project. All we've seen is a perpetual magical infrastructure re-announcement tour, running around the country trying to claim old projects as new. And let's have a look at the starting point that they had. In 2007, Australia was 20th in the OECD in terms of infrastructure investment as a proportion of GDP. When the change of government happened, we were first in the OECD. We doubled the roads budget and we built or repaired 7,500 kilometres of road. We rebuilt or repaired 4,000 kilometres of rail. 1/3 of the interstate rail freight network was rebuilt. We created Infrastructure Australia, an independent body that was taken seriously, of which all 15 priority projects were funded by the government. We allocated more to public transport projects than all previous governments combined, from Federation right through to 2007. We created the Major Cities Unit within the Department of Infrastructure to drive policies aimed at increasing the productivity, sustainability and livability of Australian cities. We not only lifted funding, we put in place proper processes. We had Australia's first ever National Urban Policy, Our Cities, Our Future. We had a National Urban Policy Forum. We worked with local government to make sure that the decision-making took place at the local level for local projects through the Australian Council of Local Government and the Regional Local Community Infrastructure Program. 2 years on, we've seen so much rhetoric from those opposite. But I used to say that the only hole that they dug is the one that they buried the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in. But we know now that that isn't quite true, because they dug a hole at Palmerston Hospital. They dug a hole on a Friday for a media conference. And then on the Saturday they went back and filled the hole in. Filled it in. This is a project that had been funded by the former government in 2013, not acted upon by those opposite, so they dug a hole at great cost to the taxpayer for a media conference and then filled it in, and work has still not progressed. It says it all about the government and their substance failure, but spin success or attempt. Even in the statement just read by the Deputy Prime Minister, you look at the projects that he mentioned. Have a look at them. The Pacific Highway. Well, we put $7.9 billion into the Pacific Highway compared with the Howard government under National Party ministers $1.3 billion. The project has actually slowed as a result of the state government cutting funding for the Pacific Highway. NorthConnex in New South Wales, the MOU was signed between the Commonwealth and the state, actually in the Coalition Party room in Macquarie Street, funnily enough, by myself and Duncan Gay. The only time I'd ever gone into a Coalition Party room, although I must say that the National Party do have good Christmas functions, and I have been there to concede that to the Deputy Prime Minister. But it was signed in June 2014. 2014 it was signed, and yet they claim they gave it a new name and they pretend it's a new project. Northern Sydney Freight Rail. I started construction on that with then Premier Barry O'Farrell. Funded in 2011. Moorebank Intermodal, established by us, opposed by them. Yeah, that's right. Your member for Hughes ran a huge campaign, scare campaign against Moorebank Intermodal. Now they want to claim credit for it. In Victoria, the M80, that they've actually cut funding for in the budget, then they re-announce some of it back and pretends it's a new project. There's still less money in there than there was when they came to office. Princess Highway East began in 2012. The Western Highway began in 2012. And of course, Regional Rail Link, opposed by those opposite, but where the member for Corangamite keeps trying to pretend that it's new. It's open. It's open. People saw the work that was taking place on that project that kept Victoria going. Then we go to Queensland, the Bruce Highway. I'll make a prediction. Next week, when Yeppoon is opened, over the Yeppoon floodplain, those opposite will pretend they had anything to do with that project. Anything to do with the project. Unfortunately for the Deputy Prime Minister, there's photos of the construction on site with then Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Then Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Then Member for Capricornia Kirsten Livermore. All there. All there. Just like the other Bruce Highway projects where they have not put a dollar into the Bruce Highway. The Cape Yorks package they pretend is new. Again, funded by Labor. Gateway North, funded by the former Labor government. Warrego, funded by the former Labor government. Moreton Bay Rail Link, where when we announced it during the 2010 election, their candidate for Petrie opposed it on Brisbane radio, said it was a waste of money. But you can't get him away from it. Now the new member for Petrie, he's camped there, outside the Moreton Bay Rail Link, camped, trying to claim credit for this project, first promised in 1895 but delivered by the federal Labor government. Townsville Ring Road began construction in 2012. Tiger Brennan I turned the first sod on, the latest section, which will complete the entire duplication of Tiger Brennan. Northern Territory Regional Roads, again, a Labor government-funded package. I will say this, there is a project in the Northern Territory that's theirs, Outback Way. I concede that. $20 million they have. It goes from Cairns to Perth. $20 million. You couldn't get out a texter and draw a line from Cairns to Perth for $20 million. And yet they claim they're doing something on Outback Way, a project that goes thousands of kilometres where the maintenance in that part of the world is extraordinarily expensive. And of course then we go to South Australia. They claim the Torrens to Torrens project. It was actually in pre-construction, fully funded at the time of the change of government. They stopped it. They stopped the work on Torrens to Torrens while they investigated Darlington down the road. Now they've continued it and pretended that it's new. Myself and Kate Ellis and Steve Georgianis were there for the beginning of the construction on that project in 2013. Then we get to WA. This is one of the best. And my friend, the minister, would be aware of this. Because during the WA Senate election, they pretended Gateway WA was a new project. This was a project where some of it had already opened. They had 2,500 people working on the project at the time. That began construction in 2011. And then in 2014, they're pretending it's new. Just like the Great Northern Highway, Machia to Woburn, Northlink and North West Coastal were all funded in the 2013 budget. Then we get to Tasmania. The Midland Highway, where they've actually reduced the funding from $500 million to $400 million. Tasmanian Freight Rail, which was included in the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, where they've actually halved the funding. They've halved the size of the project for rail revitalisation. Then, of course, we get to Roads to Recovery, where it was as a result of Labor's initiative that you see such a big increase. Indeed, when you look at the projects, Mr Deputy Speaker, I have here the full list of all of their re-announcements. All of their re-announcements, one by one. The Pacific Highway re-announced 8th of January, 21st of March, 17th September, 22nd December 2014, and 26 March, 1 April and 28 April 2015. Moorebank Intermodal re-announced 13 December 2013. You go right through all the projects. Regional Rail Link, they pretended at the opening that they had something to do with that. Duplication of Clyde Road re-announced 21 February 2014. Princess Highway West re-announced 31 December 2014. It goes on and on, the announcements. If only, Mr Deputy Prime Minister, every time you announce something it actually meant more construction, then maybe unemployment wouldn't have gone up under this government. But the fact is that it has. Unemployment is now higher than it was at the time that you were elected. And then to give the minister credit for courage, he went on to the National Broadband Network and mentioned the Skymaster satellite and the fact that one of them was launched in October 2015. The coalition opposed it. The current Prime Minister opposed it. He said it was a bad idea. He said it was a waste of money. He said it wouldn't work. He said it wouldn't work. But now that it's happened, they have the hide to come in here and to try and claim this project as their own. Claim this project as their own, which is quite extraordinary. They also now want to wipe out any of the memory that is there of their extraordinary decision under former Prime Minister Abbott, the member for Warringah, to withdraw all public transport funding and to withdraw any engagement from urban policy or cities for our national government, any involvement at all. Now, this is a place, of course, where 80% of Australians live and where 80% of our GDP derives from. And yet they removed urban policy completely from the Commonwealth agenda. They want to pretend now that they actually are interested in public transport. Well, they can start by putting back the more than $4.5 billion that they've cut. They mention the Gold Coast Light Rail Stage 2 project, but the funding, the $95 million for that, came from a save from the Moreton Bay Rail Link. The Queensland government have been desperate to use the save. That's a total of $150 million for other productivity-boosting infrastructure, and weren't allowed to do so. The Victorian government have been desperate for 2 years, to use the funds that have been sitting in the bank account that have ensured that Victoria has received just 8% of national infrastructure funding under this government. And they'll come along, and that's their own fault, they say, that they won't breach an election promise. They axed a project that had a cost-benefit analysis of 45 cents for every dollar. Well, I'll do a deal with you, Mr Deputy Prime Minister, and here's the deal through you. If you give me $1, I'll give you 45 cents back. If you give me $1,000, I'll give you $450 back. And see if you'll do that. Because that's the deal that was on the table for the Victorian economy. At a time when the Melbourne Metro, such a vital project for the productivity, sustainability and livability of Melbourne, was cut by $3 billion. So I'm sure down the track we might see some money put back into the Melbourne Metro, and then they'll say, look, this is somehow, we're contributing this new funding. Forget about the cuts that were made. It's like the Managed Motorways program for the Monash Freeway, where Greg Hunt, one of the 5 people apparently in charge of cities now for those opposite, pretended on page 1 of the Herald Sun that this was a new announcement. In fact, they cut it in the 2014 budget. They put some of it back a year and a bit later and pretend somehow that people should be grateful. This is all lost opportunities. Lost opportunities. You need good evidence-based policy making. That's why Infrastructure Australia should not have been sidelined, as it has by this government. There isn't a single project that's been funded by this government upon the recommendation of Infrastructure Australia. Not one has Infrastructure Australia said this is a project that should be funded, followed by government funding. Just like the State of Australian Cities report that identified the phenomenon of drive-in, drive-out suburbs, that identified urban congestion in our cities that will cost some $50 billion by 2031 if left unaddressed. The State of Australian Cities report, they actually produced it. They printed 200 copies of it, and then they pulped it.
Down the memory hole.
And then they pulped it at a great cost to the Commonwealth. All of the intellectual property, symbolic of the approach of this government towards rigour and towards evidence-based decision-making. They pulp a report that should have been the basis for good policy making. Well, this is a government that actually needs to deliver on more than just rhetoric. They need to make sure that they not just ride on public transport, they fund public transport. Not just the money that they should put back, but the additional projects that our cities need. We have a proud record of nation building when it comes to infrastructure development, and we would continue to do just that in the fine tradition of Labor. Those opposite have failed on infrastructure, and it's no wonder the member for Warringah is too embarrassed to mention infrastructure as a part of his legacy.